tell me what are some of the main subjects that have um, attracted your attention over the years, and explain why.
Well, having grown up in Trinidad and grown up among different groups, you become aware sometimes of differences in culture, differences in perspectives, differences in ambitions. And while this never affected the relations between and among people and the groups and so on, it does alert you to the importance of differences and cultural, whether cultural or otherwise. I was born in Guayco, Tamana, grew up for part of my life in Piaco village, then at Aruca, and went to school in Port of Spain, and was taught largely by African secondary school teachers. And that experience shaped my thinking about the world around me and so on. So that when I went into teaching, having done A-levels and so on, I went to teach at the Sangre Grande Hindu College. And I started there in the early 50s and became aware of the emerging divide, exacerbated divide between the African community and the Indian community. And I witnessed at first hand some of the difficulties that generated. So what I tried to do was to ensure that the students and the teachers should produce at the maximum. They should be as good as the African descended population in terms of education, because it must not be forgotten that up to about 1960, over 50% of the Indian community was illiterate. The college was then under the control of the Mahasabha. And after a few years, the college was able to establish itself as one of the premier colleges in Sangre Grande. At that point, I decided that I wanted to, as we put it in those days, further my studies. And the natural choice was, of course, Mona in Jamaica. So I went to Jamaica there and lived in one of the halls, Taylor Hall, which was an experience in itself, because Taylor Hall brought the elites of different groups together, living together as brothers and sisters. And the meaning of brothers and sisters acquired special significance when I went there. Of course, our lecturers and our teachers were mainly whites or African descended people, West Indians, and that further increased my respect for the teachers and other people whom I encountered. I must say it was one of the most formative experiences of my entire life up to that period in time. Having come from a country, I, of course, now in the company of so-called island scholars, and island scholars from the various territories, and whites from Europe and America, I felt a certain amount of trepidation since I was a country bumpkin. But when I did better than was expected, I felt inspired. And one of the persons who inspired me was C.L.R. James, and I proceeded to do my thesis, my master's thesis on C.L.R. James. That in turn prompted me in the direction of what I would call African studies, so that when I got a scholarship to Manchester University, I proceeded to do a thesis on West African intellectuals and their ideologies. And I was urged to compare them with the ideologies of the Caribbean. So I did countries like Senegal, Ghana, what is now Ghana, and the Caribbean, and the French as well as the British Caribbean. And out of that experience, I became conscious of how different peoples saw the colonial experience. The African descended community largely saw it as one of crude colonization and exploitation. Other communities saw it differently, so that you had back to Africa movements, whereas you never had such movements in the case of indentured labor. So I became very conscious of that kind of difference of perspective and began to understand why there was such a difference in perspective. And so that when I was appointed as a lecturer at St. Augustine, my first foray was into discussions about race, because I joined the staff in 1970 at a time when Trinidad was in ferment. A number of the Black Power people were students of mine, and I used to lecture them on sections in political thought, and I spoke about Africa, about the heroes of Africa, and the theorists like George Padmore, C.L.R. James, and a fellow from Ghana by the name of Casely Hayford. And I began to explain why they adopted the theories they adopted, or the attitudes they adopted. And out of that experience, myself and colleagues at St. Augustine formed what was called a Committee on Afro-Indian Solidarity. The whole idea was to try to bring the two groups together. For one reason or another, the committee didn't get very far, but an interest was stimulated, and the African community, at least the spokesman of the African community, was not only calling on Indians and Africans to unite, but that they should understand one another and understand the historical experiences to which they were subject. So from there, it was a logical step to organize a conference on Indians, because very few people had written about Indians in Trinidad up to that time. I think one of the few people was Morton Class, and Vera Ruben to some extent. But there was very little written on the Indian community. So that the conference was organized, and it did stimulate some consciousness of identity, as the Black Power Conference did with the African descended population. And out of that emerged a book, Calcutta to Caroni. Now, we saw it as just an attempt to educate the wider society on the position and aspirations of the Indian community, the historical background and so on. But others felt that it contained a potential for division. But there couldn't have been division, because the community was never united in that kind of way. But what it simply did was to heed the message of the Black Power people, that people must know their culture and their background, so that people, out of that emerged a kind of preoccupation with the problems of one group or another. And we felt at that point that we needed organizations to transcend the emerging divergences. And I spoke about the Committee for Afro-Indian Solidarity. There was another, we thought that education would do it. And along with Lloyd Braffett and a few others, John Spence and a few others, we formed a study group for Thursday evenings, where we would discuss contemporary problems of the Caribbean. Out of that effort emerged a journal entitled Caribbean Issues, which unfortunately only saw a few issues. But there we tried to discuss problems of Caribbean integration and identity and other issues agitating the Caribbean community. It was at that point that I got involved in administration. Around that time, or just soon after 1970, there was the establishment of what was called the Afro-Asian Studies Unit. A professor from India was brought down to Trinidad, and the unit established, and I became the first chairman. And the whole idea was to promote African and Asian studies, because we felt that if people knew their histories and backgrounds and special problems, that there will be greater understanding.
Yeah. So, so it would appear as if because around that time there's a lot of social dialogue
Yes.
on these issues.
Yes.
To what extent would you say, led by the academics, as opposed to a conversation led by politicians and activists?
Yes. Well, because Black Power eventually became a kind of political expression, it was inevitable that the politicians would become interested in these kinds of issues. And I must say that the establishment of the Afro-Asian Studies Unit was an attempt to address some of the issues raised by the cultural currents at the time, the Black Power currents, and the reactions to them. Because at first there was some apprehension about the assertion of African nationalism and Black Power sentiments. But after some time, people began to understand what it was about. Of course, by that time it had become overtaken by other elements like NUF and others,
Yeah.
and it was felt that it was getting out of hand, and of course the government reacted as they saw fit. But it did lead to some kind of consideration about the alleviation of problems in Trinidad. And I think soon after, I can't remember, maybe it was around 1974, that Williams decided that he would take control over what he called the commanding heights of the economy. And that was the period in which a number of state enterprises came under the control of the government. But it was in the name of the message that had been raised by Black Power that they did that. But I think the hope was that the state would use its power to address the various problems raised by these movements at the time.
But do you think that that intervention sufficiently addressed the concerns of people who
I don't think so. It soon became a kind of political takeover without addressing the fundamental problems, because the fundamental problems at the time were things like unemployment, rising prices, difficulties in finding jobs, relevant educational systems. These were the problems of the particular point in time.
So you would say, like, for example, the Petrotrin issue that has now sort of exploded in our faces.
Yes, well, there is a long legacy behind Petrotrin in that respect, because that legacy was part and parcel of the ideology of taking control over the commanding heights of the economy. And of course, the oil was a major pillar of the economy.
So then you found that, following that early period.
And 1975, where Caroni Limited was taken over.
Okay, I was coming to that, because coming later on in the 70s, you had Caroni 1975 Limited.
Yes.
And then you had a sort of corresponding set of shifts in the political dynamic with the emergence of the United Labour Front and so on. To what extent were you looking at these developments in the context of your concern about greater understanding of the race relations in the country and how people got along?
Well, what it demonstrated to me, and what I wrote about, is that a new kind of leadership was emerging. The leadership of the early 50s was, in the case of the Indian community, was of course Badis Maharaj on behalf of the Indian community. But it soon became apparent that Badis was not up to that task. People were looking for more, what they considered to be more enlightened leadership. And I think people like Basdev Pandey provided that kind of image. not only did he provide that kind of image, but he also provided a kind of leftist image. And it was felt that that kind of leadership was the leadership that could deal with Williams. Because one has to remember that people in those days lionized Williams. Williams was, by some of his supporters, was said to be the third most learned man in the world. But after the establishment of UWI at St. Augustine, that myth began to erode, because a lot of the critics of Williams came from the UWI, so that the image of Williams as the man who knew everything was no longer tenable, so that the government itself was forced into being more careful about how they governed and how they what kind of messages they sent out.
Yeah. And so 76 comes, in terms of your research and your writing and so on, what kind of, did it take a different direction at that point?
Well, the idea was to demonstrate that you need, first of all, more enlightened leadership to have a functioning two-party system. Secondly, that there needed to be integration of the two major groups, because it was felt, I felt at least, that the artificial division between the two communities was inimical to the proper functioning of a two-party system, where one party would be in power for some time and another would take its place and go on. And it was not surprising that in 1976 there were moves to broaden the base of political parties. Of course, it only by that time too the cracks had begun to appear in the PNM, when Hudson Phillips began to express some uneasiness with the leadership of Williams, out of which the ONR was born, for instance. And it was only a matter of time before these groups would have experimented with coming together. They did try in 76, but it failed. And the lessons of that failure were apparent. So that it was not surprising that in 81 and in 86, in particular, in 86, when they came together under the NAR, the reign of the PNM came to an end after 30 years.
Yes.
Well, as I said, Calcutta to Caroni was merely intended to educate the wider community on the position of the Indians, their historical backgrounds, and so on. That was in keeping with the message and the revelations that the Black Power movement had brought about. Thereafter, I focused more on the difficulties now of bringing together the groups. And I remember doing a book entitled The Agony of the Left, in which I tried to demonstrate that the left misunderstood the nature of integration. The left felt that the one community was national minded and the other community was backward, emphasizing cultural things and so on. But I pointed out that both groups, if it were something about which they should feel guilty, were guilty, because both groups were going separate ways, because they were championing separate cultural causes. And I was showing that both groups too had their cultural concerns, and so that it was inevitable that, given the identity crisis and so on, that people would seek their cultural roots. But what one needed was a vision and an organization that will transcend these limitations. And that was the message. But you first had to recognize that both groups were culpable, not only one group. And that was the message of the book.
Okay, and so from that period of the 70s and the financial shift, 76, led into 81 for the election there, where for the first time you had this kind of amalgamation of groups in opposition to to the PNM.
Yeah.
How, from an academic standpoint, what were the sort of signals you were picking up at the time, and how did your work reflect that?
Well, first of all, I was looking at some of the divisions within, the latent divisions within the NAR, and how they complicated the relationship. And also, I also tried to point out that people went into politics not just for the honor of it or just to serve the people, but interests, political interests, had to be contained, and that there had to be a measure of sharing of power in the whatever arrangements that that were finally arrived at, because otherwise people will get the impression that they are merely being the handmaid of one group or another. In other words, group perception of interest was very strong in Trinidad, and one needed to accommodate to these kinds of perceptions and aspirations.
Were you at the same time keeping an eye on what was happening inside the PNM and the Afro-Trinidadian element?
Well, I also pointed out that that the state needed to re-examine its cultural policy, and what I found was that the state emphasized and gave resources predominantly to African cultural expressions, and that they should find something that they should find. I suggested that there should be an independent cultural body to allocate resources to cultural groupings, rather than leaving it to the state, because so far you will find that there were a lot of imbalances in the allocations to cultural groupings.
Where can I find stuff that you wrote on?
The title of that paper is called The Dilemmas of Cultural Policy.
Because that has re-emerged.
Yes, you'll find it there.
Yeah.
And it's a book published by Extramural.
Okay.
I can't remember the name, Planning or something in Trinidad and Tobago.
Okay, I have most of those publications.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is the one, yeah.
Right, so so you had the 86 experience, leading now into, I think the next significant development was 1990.
Yes.
And the collapse of the NAR experiment. What were your feelings about the situation?
Well, I tried to show that the 1990 attempted coup, and Abu Bakr himself was a prisoner of the cultural drive in politics, because I showed where, for instance, he too was very much involved in, when he was talking about culture, mainly African culture. So he did not have a unified approach to the cultural question. That he too was a prisoner of that cultural background. And what I urged was that they should try to transcend that. Because when you emphasize one cultural expression over another, you are saying in effect that you are more committed to this group rather than another group. That was the message I tried to convey when I wrote about the 1990 expression here. And I showed how the reaction of the Indians to 1990 was perfectly consistent with that view I've just elaborated.
And then from 1991, the virtual collapse of the NAR, you've had like seasons of change, and we seem to have never really come to a place of settled position, socially and politically. Well,
first of all, I don't think the original people are recognizing, I think since then, and largely out of that experience, that coalition politics of one kind or another is the only way forward. That no one group will be able to win power just like that. There needs to be some kind of accommodation. In other words, one has to recognize the cultural divisions and integrate them into your party programs and your party messages and party alignments.
But is that also a prospect that's available to the PNM?
That's available to the PNM too. But the PNM, remember, has always been able to capture political power by default on the part of the opposition. The history of the opposition has been the history of internecine feuding because of the nature of the base of the opposition.
Elaborate on that for me.
Well, when I said internecine feuding, the opposition originally was largely based on the Indian community. The Indian community was divided on the basis of region, caste, and other divisions. Even when other groups joined with the opposition, they too had separate agendas. So that the opposition has largely been a coming together of a number of different groups, whereas the PNM has largely been an African-descended population with support from the Muslim community, without these kinds of complications.
Yeah, but wouldn't that, Lloyd Best spoke about the tribes, and tribes that existed even within the sort of ambit of Afro-Trinidad PNM culture. So
well, there are divisions. There are divisions, say, between the Tobago, Trinidad, African people. There are divisions between them. Within Trinidad, however, there is greater unity among the African-descended population, although in recent times that kind of unity is being challenged, partly or largely because new generations are coming into existence and people are supporting political parties not only because of ethnic affiliation or ethnic identity, but what they think that the party has done for them or for the communities or the areas where they live. So that even the perspectives on politics has been undergoing some change.
So has your most recent, and we could probably move into the book now. So let me just pause here and take it again.
Yeah. Well, my two most recent books were published by Lexington Press, and what I tried to show in the comparison between Guyana and Trinidad is what essentially are really two different communities. In the case of Guyana, one had a dominant Indian group there, and which, because of its size, was able to dominate the politics of Guyana for a long time. Not only that, one can understand the politics of Guyana in relation to the rest of the Caribbean by reference to the fact that they had an overwhelming majority in Guyana. One understands the reluctance of Jagan, the premier at the time, to take part in the federation, because he realized that in a federation with the rest of the Caribbean, his power would be eroded in Guyana. So he was always lukewarm in support of the federation of the Caribbean. It also explains why, in the case of Trinidad, there has also been some concern with the size of the Indian community in relation to the African community. It also explains why there have been proposals to have a mini federation of Trinidad, Barbados, and St. Vincent, so that the racial imbalances, the group imbalances could be corrected.
And correspondingly, you had the Panday formula of Trinidad, Guyana, and Suriname.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But do you think that's a kind of rational, at the end of the day, is that a sort of rational way of...
Well, for the politicians, they see it in terms of votes, and votes mean political power. And they assume, I think in a number of cases wrongly, that people will vote on the basis of racial affiliation. As we have been witnessing in a number of elections in Trinidad, it's not only ethnic affiliation which determines the vote. A number of things sometimes have to do with the amenities, the quality of your representation, the caliber of your leadership, your cabinet leadership as well, and all of that. It's not just only about ethnic identity.
While you're on that, there's an issue I'm looking at now, trying to get a microscopic view on, which is the long-standing view that Eric Williams virtually imported votes from Grenada and St. Vincent in the early years in order to affect the political balance. Is that something you have looked at?
Well, not in any great detail, but I do have some views on it. One could remember at one time in the early 50s that there were songs about people beating Grenadians in the square. Mm-hmm. In other words, there was some hostility towards the Grenadians. But after the recognition that group balances are very important for political power, the immigration policies certainly reflected that concern, so that it was easier for some groups to be accommodated in Trinidad rather than other groups. Also, one must remember that when the Federation collapsed, Williams offered unitary statehood to Grenada, and it was Arthur Lewis. And it's important to recognize this. It was Arthur Lewis who pointed out that that Williams only offered unitary statehood to Grenada, not because of any commitment to Grenada or anything of the kind, but because he needed more votes to counteract the imbalances in the vote in Trinidad.
Yeah, but then the mathematics would have been different there, because if you had Grenada, instead of the 36 seats or whatever number they had at the time, you would have had 40 or whatever. I don't know. I'm looking at.
But in any case, the majority, the majorities would have been affected.
Because what I've been trying to look at is that the constituencies at the time, the 36 constituencies, 61 and 66, how those were configured, whether an influx. Although if you want to talk about influx, you're going back to 18th and 19th century, because you had free flow at that time. So there was no real distinction between who is Grenadian and who is Trini. From a statistical standpoint, because it was all British Empire, and these people coming, and so we would have had people from Grenada and so on who were settled, but they are now...
Yeah, but after unitary statehood, remember this was in 1967, eh?
Yeah.
By then it would have been an independent state.
Right.
And they could have allocated by their housing policies people in critical areas and constituencies.
But did that happen? I mean,
it didn't take place.
Yeah, because, so what I'm saying is that are there grounds for challenging that notion? Because the distribution of the newcomers from Grenada and St. Vincent in particular would have had to be so widespread that you would have had to be able to in order to win elections.
No, well, what you do, what could have been done is to identify certain constituencies that are deemed marginal, and allocate your housing units accordingly.
Yeah, because I'm just, it's something I'm looking at.
But it's not only that. One has to remember, in the case of the vote, it's not only the ethnic thing. It has a lot to do with other factors. Ethnic identity is just one factor.
Sure.
And other considerations are sometimes equally important, if not more important.
Right.
You follow?
Yeah.
Then you have to understand too the mood of the election. In 61, ethnic tensions were highest because that was the election that would determine who would control the state. So this is why we had so much violence in 1961. Although, whatever you may say, there has never been a single death relating to ethnic violence during elections in Trinidad.
And then I think you would have had the federal elections
in 58.
In 58, which would have sort of signaled that the Indian population here were quite prepared to vote as a bloc. So there was this sort of thing.
Yeah, but what one is finding from 1956, 1958 is the gradual erosion of that powerful ethnic bond
Yes.
on the part of both groups,
Yep.
both African and Indian, so that the young voter now, remember the vote is now 18 years and more,
Yeah.
the young voter is more influenced by other kinds of issues.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
And
no,
in the age of social media and the cell phone,
mhm.
and the kind of information that people are getting now, the politicians will have to do a lot more than just appeal to ethnic identity.
Definitely. I mean, I use my son as an example. He's 23.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And his reality is more than just what is happening in St. Joseph or even Trinidad.
Yeah.
On a daily basis, he's in touch. They are now global human beings.
Of course.
So all these notions of...
Yes, of course.
But I'm glad, I will keep in touch with you with that, because I want to write a piece,
Okay.
a newspaper piece on this thing. I think it is largely a myth that you had this sort of linear relationship between the so-called influx of Vincentians and Grenadians and the success of the PNM in those years. And linear, because as you're saying, there are more things, there are more issues that you need to consider. But I think that if somebody needs to sit, and I haven't seen, I looked all over, but you have politicians saying all the time, and especially when you see reference to, the small islanders, even in 2018, people are saying that. All these small islanders and things, you listen to...
Yeah, well, they look for scapegoats.
Right.
In times of challenge, under periods of economic stress, people find scapegoats everywhere. Either among the Syrians or among the small islanders or Nigerians or some
Venezuelans.
Venezuelans, they find scapegoats. Yeah.
All right, so talk to me about this.
Yes.
People are demanding.
Well, what I try to do in this book, it's really a book about race. Essentially, I was trying to show that that in Trinidad, most people are a cultural Malay. That when we talk about African identity or Indian identity or even white identity, it's really an amalgam of different cultural streams, and that it leads us into all kinds of contradictory statements and situations. And in the case of my own mother, she was mixed with African. My grandmother, she was a Muslim, but she was more Indian, but she looked Amerindian to me, with her eyes being what they are and so on, and her color and so on. And my stepfather, of course, was a Brahmin Indian, but although he was a so-called Brahmin Indian, he was culturally mixed. Although he may have been racially pure Brahmin, he was culturally mixed. So he became a failed pundit. He was a taxi driver. He was a PH driver. He also became a seaman. So, and he too inherited cultural prejudices from here, there, and everywhere. In other words, he was a cultural Malay and a medley of cultures, as was particularly my mother. My mother was a mixture of cultures, a mixture of races, a mixture of regions. She lived in Piarco, she lived in Aruca, she lived in Tamana, she lived in St. Augustine. But she lived between the country and the modern world and was never comfortable. She couldn't be comfortable. She couldn't. For one, I remember a famous expression by her when she was staying in St. Augustine with me. She said she can't understand the people in Santa Margarita. The white people play in black and the black people play in white. So she confused.
Yeah.
You follow? So it was a confusion of cultures almost everywhere. And I think that's the story of Trinidad. We try to, when people talk about Africa. People don't, and none of them know they know very little about Africa. They know similarly with India. A lot of people know, although that experience is a little more enduring, but it is still a lot different from what actually obtains in India. And so it is with the whites too. The French here are a lot different from the French I knew when I was a student in France. You see? So it is a recreated world out of a medley of cultures. That's my feeling.
So what does it do to the long-standing theories about the true nature of Trinidad and Tobago society?
I would say the true nature of Trinidadian society is that it is a mixture of different cultural currents coming from a number of different countries. Latin American, French, European. I say European too because we had a German community in Trinidad. English, African, largely West Africa, but also some Muslim segments of Africa, particularly around Piccadilly Street, particularly around there. And in India, people from Madras as against people from Bihar. In other words, the gulf between North India and South India at one time existed in Trinidad between the Biharis and the Madrasis. That is one division that remained faithful in Trinidad as it was to India. Of course, you know about that division.
Yeah. So, no.
But again, one has to remember too that the caste system is also based on color, largely on color.
So, academics, to me, are the people who are supposed to be helping the society understand itself. So you belong to a generation in which the reality was different. Because you speak, for example, about class, and you talk about ideology and the role of the left. A lot of that is sort of disappearing now, even though it's still there.
Although they will still have some ideology.
Yes.
Because you must have an idea of why this is so and why that is so and so on. Some explanation of the reality that you face. You may see it in terms of economics, they may see it in terms of, we don't see things in terms of East-West or communism or socialism or capitalism anymore, but we still have a vision of why things are how they are.
So when you talk to the current generation of academics now, what kind of instruction or guidance do you give them in terms of trying to understand the society better?
Well, I try to tell them what power is about, how people achieve power, what criteria they use to achieve power. How effective they will be at a local level as against national level, and what kind of expectations people are going to have in this period.
Okay, and finally, what projects do you have in the mill right now? What are the issues you're looking at?
Well, my limitation is, of course, my vision and physical condition. But what I'm looking at now is, and my last book tried to show that when we talk about race is a general category, and what it does is to encapsulate a number of other concerns. It has to do with physical similarities. It also has to do with the region you occupy. It also has to do with your dress, the way you dress. It also has to do with the interactions you have had. It also has to do with whether you are located at a border or in the central part of a country. If you are at the border, there's more interaction. And the quality of your leaders, what they choose to emphasize. Leaders will emphasize what will bring more support. If you decide to emphasize one thing over another, it has to meet their interests. If that is the way to satisfy their interests, then you will go for it. You see, like if you find scapegoats, that is one reason for finding scapegoats. You will blame all your economic difficulties on some other group or some other person. But it also springs from the basic psychology of primitive times, where at a time when people moved around in groups, and you were always fearful of the other group, because the other group would either come and attack you or take away your resources. So it's a very complicated, race is a very complicated expression, because it encapsulates so many other considerations. And what theorists of race, future theorists of race, is to try to unravel the separate ingredients, which is to some extent what I try to do.